Hello, welcome insiders. It is noon in New York. I see everybody's doing the roll call, so happy to have you. Good to see you all. We are very excited and cheering Ralph on because we really want to see this presentation. Hi, Mary. Hi, Marcy. Hi, Robert. Hi, Michael. Hi, Klaus. Glad to see New Yorkers. We've got people from Virginia. We've got Asheville again. Mark from Boston. All great to see you guys here today. I'm not going to take up too much time. I want Ralph to get going, but just to let you know, there is a trivia component to this presentation. So I think what we're going to do is there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. The person to answer the question correctly first in the chat will take the question. I'm going to do it this way since on the last time we did trivia with another program, we had the same person answering correctly first. If you get 3 or more right, your grand prize will be a free month of membership to Insiders. If not, then we'll start doing tote bags, t-shirts. I believe we have markers, but I have to double check with Michelle. So stay tuned. If I tell you to, at the end of the presentation, either send me your address or privately chat it to me so I can send you if I'm sending you something. For those of you who are on the Pride pub crawl and still not have gotten your gifts yet, that's because I haven't sent them. But I'm going to wait till we do all of these and then go to the post office once. I kind of only want to make one trip because my post office is like COVID central. Sorry, in my mind, I'm sorry. All right, so without further ado, I am going to unmute Ralph and go for it. Everybody enjoy the presentation. I will be coming back on to announce the winners of the question each time. Ralph.
Are you going to unmute? You unmuted me, I take it?
I unmuted you and we can
Oh,
hear you.
great. Okay.
It's all good, Ralph. It's all, as we like to say, it's all you in a bag of chips.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Justin. And thank you guys for staying home and logging in. I'm really happy to be a part of the Insiders. I think you guys are all really cool to be Untapped Cities Insiders. Thank you so much to Untapped Cities and to Michelle and Justin for having me come talk to you guys today and tell you a little bit about this thing that I'm so excited about. So I also want to thank my creative team here. A solo show is sort of an oxymoron. I think it really took a lot of people to put this together, and I'm really grateful to all of them as well. So yes, you know, my name is Ralph Lewis, and for the past 26 years, I have been making theater in Manhattan, mostly downtown, as the co-director of a company called Peculiar Works Project. Now, Peculiar Works Project, we do what's called site-specific theater, which really just means we make theater, but not in theaters. So it's probably a little ironic that I'm here today to talk about actual theaters. If you love New York City and or theater as much as I do, hopefully you'll enjoy hearing about some of their intersections. Now, this all came about because of this book that I just became obsessed with. It's called Before and Behind the Curtain, and it's really just become an excuse for me to talk about theater in New York, how it got started, its humble beginnings, right up until 1851, which is when this book was published. So we're going to talk a lot about the early 1800s. I hope you'll like these images, but as I like to tell people, this is more about theatrical archaeology than it is architecture. And hopefully the trivia questions will be a little fun too. So, Before and Behind the Curtain, or 15 Years of Observations Among the Theaters of New York. Wow. Okay, I know we're actually reading a lot from tablets and small screens, but I just want to say, just having the actual book really meant a lot to me. I think it really sort of played a role in how I connected with this author and his story. And of course, I also have the $12 version as well. But I just think this book has really meant a lot to me. So I hope you will indulge me if I read a few excerpts from it as we go along. Okay, first, the publisher here, W.F. Burgess, they were at 22 Ann Street, which is across from Theater Alley, which until recently, it still had its Theater Alley street sign, although I understand it's no longer there at the moment. Maybe it'll come back. And indeed, at one point, this was an alley behind a theater just west of City Hall Park, if you know the area. This must have really been a happening place at the time that this book was published. Now, the wall separating the city from the country was already Wall Street by then, and progress was moving north. The park was actually a common gathering place for the residents. In fact, the original name for it was the Common. And our writer, Dr. William Knight Northall. Okay, I couldn't find a photo of him, so I made one up, but I like to imagine maybe he was a behind the scenes kind of guy. So he arrives from England in 1834, where he had trained to be a dentist. But he comes to New York and discovers theater, and like a lot of us, a new life begins for him. He's actually known as the first dramatist of Brooklyn, where he was the editor and critic of a local newspaper. He wrote plays and performer biographies, and he was involved in the Brooklyn art scene. He wrote these scripts called travesties for Manhattan theaters. Travesties were these like parody ripoffs of popular classics that regular people could understand a bit better. But he never gave up his day job like a lot of us. He gives lectures on dentistry around the country before dying of cholera on a ship returning to New York, which reminded me of some of the early days of our pandemic. You can tell he really cares a lot about his subject. He wasn't just giving a theater by theater account. It's like he felt a responsibility to be entertaining, even the way he formatted the text in the book. Now, Northall covers the mid-1800s, but I want to go back further. And first, I want to say, depending on what counts as theater, the history on this is sort of murky. I mean, there were shows in taverns, there were touring productions, there were performances in other languages, there's professional versus amateur, and there's also conflicting sources and missing information, and sometimes historians just disagree on things. But with those caveats, I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that New York City gave birth to theater in America. Okay, just for context, Henry Hudson's Dutch West Indies outpost landed on the island of Manhattan in 1609. Jamestown and Williamsburg colonies and the Plymouth Pilgrims, they also start up in the first 20 years of the 1600s. Okay, so how long do you think it takes before there's any English-speaking theater to reach our shores? Of course, there's a lot to do at first, building infrastructure and really just surviving. You couldn't be going out to the theater every night. Going from outpost to colony to city took a lot of time and effort on everyone's part. So how long before there's any traditional theater in America? I thought 30 years would be a long time, 3 decades, maybe 50 years. No, double that. Nothing theatrical happens in America for over a century after Henry Hudson arrived. Now, Puritan, Quaker, and Presbyterian disdain for theater is also a reason for the slow start. They pass anti-theater laws throughout the country. See, religious groups, they hate the debauchery and immorality depicted in plays and farces. To them, really, theater is next to prostitution, and not for no reason. Sex for money often took place in the upper boxes of the large theaters. See, another reason we don't know a lot about theater in these days is because it wasn't something people were really proud to talk about. I like this one historian who said, the story of early American theater is not so much told as it is told against, because most of what we know comes from legal court documents filed by people who were trying to stop it. Now, Northall, he starts not by talking about theater, but about the demand for it from a social perspective. He believes people need a place to gather, to share time together, and specifically because of the prevalence of boarding houses. The boarding house offers very little to make the fireside attractive. There's no domestic purpose in the arrangements of a boarding house farther than eating, drinking, and sleeping are concerned. The boarders will be polite to each other and strictly observe the courtesies of life, but the heart has little to do with this. There's no bond of union among the lodgers of a boarding house. Scarcely anything short of a murder or suicide has sufficient interest to cause one boarder to feel any interest in what may be occurring to gentlemen in the next rooms. The consequence is that in the absence of fireside enjoyments, the boarders are entirely thrown upon their own resources for amusement. Public places of entertainment offer the readiest solutions to these poor, undomesticated animals. So really, our story begins in Lower Manhattan, way before the skyscrapers, right? On Nassau Street here, between what is now John Street and Maiden Lane, there's this big office building owned by the Federal Reserve. There's no surviving images really, but at first it's a small row of wood buildings, and inside that red one there is New York's very first theater. Or the original theater was on the corner of Maiden Lane and Pearl Street, and it later moved here to Nassau Street. Historians really read the clues differently. So either somebody got the initial address wrong or there were two first locations. Either way, it probably looked a lot like this red building. I understand all the theaters were painted red in the early days, and the performance space would be on the second floor here. It's not built to be a theater. It's more of a general meeting space that the actors renovate. They build a stage, they add seating, and voila, it's a theater. Okay, probably there's some amateur stuff taking place before this opened, and also shows in like local pubs like the Corbett Tavern or the King's Arms over on Broadway. But this is the first professional theater. The first documentation of a production is December 6th, 1732. Although the actors actually arrived from London in September, so there could have been performances that really predate the documentation. Some historians call it the Nassau Street Theater. Others call it the Theater on Nassau Street. But really, at the time, it was just called the theater because it was the only theater. I mean, if you told your friends you were going to the theater, they knew exactly where to find you. Some reports call it the New Theater, which might be a clue that the first structure burned down at some point, and the rebuilt venue would be called the New Theater. Okay, that bell means it's time for our first trivia question. All right, everything okay? All right. Trivia question number 1. Okay, what is the name, both then and now, of the first east-west road that was laid north of the Wall, or Wall Street? Still has the same name today, the first east-west road. All right. Okay.
So far, we've got 3 submissions, no right answer yet.
Oh, okay. Keep working on it. It still has the same name today. Okay, now the first play to perform here is The Recruiting Officer, written by a guy named George Farquhar, an Irish restoration playwright. And worldwide, this was one of the most produced plays of the 18th century. So it wasn't a curatorial risk at all. At the time, this building was owned by a former colonial governor named Rip Van Dam. I just love that name. He's the one here on the right. Name sounds kind of like a professional wrestler or something, and actually kind of looks like one. But he's the one really who made it possible for theater to finally make its New York City debut. So that's 1732 is pretty much when theater began in America. Now then there's a gap of about 15 years when we really don't know what happened, but we know something happened. But on March 5th, 1750, the actor-manager duo of Walter Murray and Thomas Keane arrived from London. They set up a resident company and about 180 seats here to present Shakespeare's Richard III. Their repertory also included the first documented performance of a musical in New York, John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, December 3rd, 1750, which at the time it was already a big smash hit in London. Now, after only a couple of years, Murray and Keane are replaced by the Hallam Company. Lewis Hallam, interesting guy, is the patriarch of a British theatrical family, and he arrives in the Williamsburg colony first in 1752 with his wife, 3 children, and a company of 10. And they debut The Merchant of Venice down there. They toured around some, but soon enough, they moved to New York, and they take over this Nassau Street venue. They run it for about 25 years, but the theater on Nassau Street starts to show its age. falling down. So the Hallam Company, they check out and tour the colonies again before heading off to the island of Jamaica. And this theater, it gets replaced by a German church. Now, over the next few years, there are a couple of temporary venues, but I want to take you to the first theater-only theater that opens just around the corner on John Street, December 7, 1767. Today, 1521 John Street is home to a variety of retail stores, including a French bistro, an Irish pub, and the ubiquitous Duane Reade. Like the theater on Nassau Street, it too is just called the theater. It's said to be the fourth formal theater, maybe the fifth, depending on how you count, but really it's the first permanent theater in New York City. But get this, okay, Lewis Hallam Sr., he dies in Jamaica. His widow, Sarah, remarries another theater manager down there, this guy, David Douglas, and they return together to the U.S. and they tour as the American Company with Lewis Jr. as their leading man. Douglas, he builds this theater on John Street as well as a couple of other theaters in New York City. And here you can see Hallam's widow, Douglas's wife, and Junior looking all terrific. These are family-owned businesses, theaters. It's a craft handed down from one member to another. But Lewis Hallam Jr. Might be America's first star. He was a very highly respected actor. Now, like the theater on Nassau Street, this theater opens with a play by George Farquhar. This time it's The Beau Stratagem. And really, I think that's two very important American distinctions for one Irish guy. Okay, so the theater on John Street is the only theater in town for 31 years. I thought that was a long time. It's also wartime. Less than a decade into its run, the Continental Congress bans theater in America. So the British soldiers, they soon take over this theater and other theaters, and Hallam and Douglas, they take the American Company back to Jamaica. The British military troops, under the direction of Major John Andre, stage plays here to sort of maintain the morale of the troops during the occupation. After the revolution, the British withdraw in 1783, and 2 years later, the Hallams returned to town and to the John Street. Time for our second trivia question. All is well? All is well. All right, trivia question number 2. Who is the infamous Patriot officer responsible for getting Major John Andre hung? Hanged? Hung. They exchanged some secret military documents that this traitor had passed along to Andre. So who was this traitor? How many traitors do you know? Okay. There was a lot of Shakespeare performed throughout the colonies, but another important play to debut on John Street is called The Contrast in 1787. It's the first play written by an American to be performed professionally. The play satirizes Americans who follow British fashion, so the contrast is already between us and them. It's most known for its prologue debating homemade goods versus imported goods. It also gave birth to the Yankee as a character in American culture. Okay, now we get to the first big theater. It's on the site that was most recently home to J&R Music World at 212325 Park Row, opposite what is now City Hall Park. It's currently under construction, I don't know, for some massive building of some kind. But it opens in 1798 as the New Theater because the John Street had become old news. It's the first theater designed to be a theater. Until now, founding company managers were really doing what my company does with site-specific theater. You take a non-theater site, a warehouse or a loft, and you just retrofit it into a theater. But this was different. And it's run by Hallam Jr. and some other folks that come over from John Street, which gets converted into a warehouse. Now, it's the only theater in town, right? New York has a theater, Philadelphia has a theater, Boston has a theater, Savannah, Charleston, you get the idea. And these theater troupes would just go from town to town, just one stop in each town. Hey, the original design, check that out. The theater is supposed to look a lot different. It's modeled on the Grand Opera House of designer Marc Brunel's French homeland. And it's built to be the theater by which all other theaters in America will be measured. But its completion got delayed for several years because the owners ran out of money. Plans for the ornate exterior had to be scrapped, so it looks rather simple from the outside. No columns or grand detailing. And it's on what was then called Chatham Street, across from the previously mentioned Common. And it starts out as the place to be. Now, on the inside, it really looks terrific. It has audience seating for 2,000, which is really incredible when you think about it. I mean, it's more than any current Broadway theater has. The theater has a patent for oil lamps, replacing candlelight, which until then was how shows were lit. It's very upscale. And in 1820, the new theater burns down. And it's rebuilt even nicer. Finally, the front is a little more fancy. It's larger, so that means it needs to attract bigger and bigger audiences to stay in business. The quality of the work really kind of becomes more populist, more working class. It's considered, less classy. And it's no longer a new theater. So when the Common becomes a park and the street changes its name to Park Row, the theater is officially renamed the Park Theater. It's really more for rebranding, but it's kind of the end of an era. By then, there's a debtor's prison next door to it. There's a tent city and an almshouse in the park across the street. In 1837, there's a Great Depression. So if you can't afford a place to live, even a boarding house, you end up in the park. So North Hall, he sees the Park Theater as becoming run down. Time for another trivia question. All right. Trivia question number 3. Okay, so at first it was called Chatham Street. Now it's called Park Row. But in between, it had a long time nickname. What was that nickname? Had to do with what was going on in the buildings that were along this row. What was that nickname? Okay, so the Park Theater is in operation for over 50 years. That is a very long time. But midway through its life, something important happens. Other theaters open. At first, just some short-term things, but then the Chatham Theater opens, and for the first time, Manhattan is no longer a one-town theater. It's a little north of Chatham Row toward the Bowery, between Pearl and Duane Streets. It's on what is now the Metropolitan Correctional Center. It's a combination saloon and pleasure garden and theater. Some call it the Chatham Garden Theater, and in 1823, it's now the hot new place to be. Not counting circuses, bear baiting, and cockfighting and other entertainments, it's the first competition to the Park Theater's supremacy, if only for a couple of years. Now the Chatham, it looks a lot like the park inside, but if you are able to look closely, you can see it's a little more ornate, more detailing. And it's not the only theater built on the grounds of a garden. There's the Mount Vernon Gardens, the Grove Theater, Niblo's Garden, even Madison Square Garden. Gardens really play a pivotal role in the lives and the development of New York City. There should be a talk just on these gardens. Vauxhall Garden in 1806 is the city's first, and it's modeled on a great English garden of the same name. Imagine at the time, there's no parks department, there's no National Park Service. Parks are not something governments manage yet. So unless you're going to risk your life out in the wilderness, gardens are the place where people go to experience nature safely. You pay a small fee, walk around, there are entertainments, musicians, even fireworks, lots of things going on. Vauxhall Garden actually had 3 locations. First, it was on the west side below Chambers Street, then Broome Street, and then finally here between Bowery, Broadway, Great Jones, and Astor Place. There was no Lafayette Place at the time, so it was really quite a large area, and you can see what it looks like today. Time for another trivia question. Moving right along here. Number 4. Okay, so what local tavern today still bears the name of its proprietor from way back then? He was our first pleasure garden owner. So what is that name of that tavern? It was named it back then. It still has the same name today. Can't be that many, but yeah, I was surprised he owned the first pleasure garden. Okay, so to give you an idea of what's happening here, this map has the first theaters on the bottom there, where City Hall Park is. The Park Theater is on the right. Ann Street's around the corner where the book was published. Theater Alley's behind Park Row, and the Chatham was just north of it. And then as theaters would get old, burn down, fall apart, they're rebuilt further up the block, further and further north, along two different routes, really. The upper class theaters are moving along Broadway, and the working class theaters along the Bowery. They're both kind of curving around the Collect Pond, which, if you don't know, it's a rare freshwater low ground that was drained a very long time ago. But our next stop along the Bowery, home to the Bowery Theater, 4650 is just below Canal Street, which wasn't even a canal yet. Today, go on to the next one. There we go. Today, it's a 20-story luxury hotel. But before it became the Bowery Theater, it was the home of the Bull's Head Tavern here, starting way back in 1750. That was when the city was still called New Amsterdam. And this outpost was far north of the wall that later became Wall Street. It's a saloon and stable where the butchers hang out, drinking, getting drunk, waiting for the drovers to herd the cattle down the Bowery, and they'd make their beef purchase here in the stalls at the Bull's Head. Now, the Astor brothers, these butchers, Henry and John Jacob here, they weren't much for drinking, right? So they would head up the Bowery and buy the best cattle before these cattle could reach the Bull's Head Tavern. And actually, the brothers make so much more money than the drunk butchers at the Bull's Head that eventually they buy it. And then later, even richer, they tear it down in 1826 and build the Bowery Theater. Originally called the New York Theater, then later the American Theater. This is just 3 years after the Chatham Theater had opened. So now there are 3 theaters in New York City, all competing for your entertainment dollar. Okay, rather coins. It also burns down more than once. And each time it's rebuilt, it has a different number of columns in the front. See, the Astors, they want a respectable venue with high-class theaters to compete with the high-class theaters that are popping up along Broadway. So this second structure is even larger, has seating for 3,500, and it's even more upscale. But it didn't stay classy for very long. Soon enough, it joined the Chatham Theater in its working class and immigrant appeal. Even though it's the first New York City venue to present ballet, it's also the home of vaudeville and minstrel shows and other blue-collar entertainments. When it's rebuilt a third time, it has fewer columns, maybe resigning itself to be less high-minded, but still, it's a really nice building. I mean, the Bowery Theater lasts a really long time, and it sees many changes and at least 5 fires, while other theaters come and go, first south of it and then later north of it. Meanwhile, over on Broadway, where there is now a city office building, the National Theater rises up. And it's one of the first big theaters on Broadway. It's built in 1833 on the northwest corner here of Church and Leonard Streets. It had a former life as an Italian opera house, but evidently that failed badly. And clearly it's our writer's favorite. The National Theater gets the most ink from North Hall by far. He often compares it to the Park Theater just to say how much better it is than the Park Theater. And of course, it burned down like a lot of these gaslit theaters. And North Hall, he captures it really, really well. I mean, I'm not sure why he's so obsessed by these fires. The National Theater afterwards fell into the able hands of James Wallach, who managed it with consummate skill and brilliant success until its destruction by fire in the month of September of 1830. The destruction of the National exercised such an influence on the theatrical affairs of New York, and for purposes of which will be seen in the course of this work, I shall here give a well-authenticated history of the burning of this establishment. And he goes on for like pages and pages talking about this fire. It's incredible. He's obsessed. The flames now burst forth with awful violence from the roof. As such was the intensity of the heat at the time that the roofs of the African Church in Leonard Street, the splendid French Church in Franklin Street, the Dutch Church also in Franklin Street, and 4 other dwellings took fire almost at the same moment. The awful grandeur of the scene at this time is impossible to describe. We've never beheld anything surpassing its splendor. The appearance of the interior of the theater, which was filled with a living sea of flames, dashing its frightful waves on all sides, then rising in immense columns to the sky, while every opening round the splendid area vomited forth fire. Oh, man. He worked so hard to make it exciting, and I just love it, really. I mean, but if you can't tell, really, fires had a dramatic impact on the theater scene in the city. And it continues to this day, actually. City fire codes, union contracts, large-scale architecture, all affected by fires today. And one of my favorites is the ghost light. There's much mystery in its history. If you don't know it, the story goes that the light is placed center stage every night after the show so that the ghosts in the theater, all theaters have ghosts, that's a known fact, can see their way around to reenact their great performances. And if the stage is allowed to go dark, well, the ghosts think they've been abandoned and they cause mysterious accidents to happen in the theater. Now, non-believers say that the light was left on overnight so that the stage manager could find their way to the lighting board and turn the work lights on the next day. Evidently, before ghost lights, a lot of stage hands were falling into the orchestra pit in the dark. So these lights also protected against liability. But, there are also theories about testing dimmers, electrical currents or something. But really, this light is one of the last remnants of the theater's first days. The very first performances lit by candlelight, but this was really dangerous. But usually when candles were lit, there were, performers around that could snuff out any flames. But in 1816, gas lights became the big new thing. Now, fire was already the greatest threat to wood-built structures, but the introduction of gas, theaters began to burn down at an even faster rate, and we're talking hundreds of fires. Gas pipes and their faucets were notoriously leaky, and if a light went out, the gas would continue to escape, and that would build up in the theater. And when the next smoker lit up or the lights were turned on the next day, boom, the place would blow up. So to prevent this buildup of gas, the ghost light is placed on the stage to burn out any wayward fumes. So the legendary ghost light is really just a big old pilot light. But that's not as much fun as theatrical ghosts, is it? Now, in 1881, the first theatrical electrical lighting system was installed, and that was the end of gas. But the ghost light was already serving so many purposes by then. And if we ever get back to the theater, maybe hang out after a show and see if the stage manager doesn't come out and put one on the stage. So the big fire at the National put a lot of theaters out of work. Having achieved a new level of respect, they were not happy to leave the National. But many of them ended up further north at the Olympic Theater. Now, the Olympic had recently moved up from Anthony Street and Broadway, and this is the second location here, opened in 1837 at 444 Broadway between Howard and Grand Streets, which is now part of the Broadway shopping corridor. It's modeled after a London theater by the same name. After only a couple of seasons there, this out-of-work actor-manager named William Mitchell takes up at the Olympic, launching the first English-style burlesque in America, and soon enough, this place is known as Mitchell's Olympic. A favorite impresario, Mitchell gets his own section in the book. I mean, although the book is really mostly about theaters, there's actually more about Mitchell than there is about the Olympic. There are even excerpts of works put on by Mitchell, flyers, and other odd ephemera. This guy's just being entertaining. The Olympic is where this character named Mose debuts, and Mose has a dramatic effect on the city, just way beyond just theater. Mose was a volunteer fireman. Now, considering how often things burnt down, it's no surprise that he's a valued character, even to people who didn't go to the theater. He wore a certain type of costume that's associated with volunteer firemen. All firemen were volunteer, like the Parks Department. It's another service that government was just not yet aware it had to provide. Volunteer firemen are our original first responders. And the character of Mose was originally performed by this guy, Frank Chanfrau, a bit character actor and theater manager. And all of a sudden, this guy becomes a big, big hit. all the cool kids on the Bowery began to imitate Mose. They dressed like Mose. He was a hero to the Bowery boys and a cultural icon in the city for over a decade. Here's how it happened. So this playwright, Benjamin Baker, he's having lunch one day in a local diner, and he meets this volunteer fireman. He's so inspired with this guy's manner of speaking, the sort of common street language, he just has to write a play with this man as a character. Understand, at the time, audiences only heard very formal speech from the stage. I mean, heightened language is what the stage was for. So hearing someone talking like Mose on stage in the vernacular of the Bowery boys was really unprecedented. I wonder if maybe it's something like Brando in 50s movies or Hamilton on Broadway. I mean, maybe the rap lyrics on a Broadway stage. I wonder if that's anything like what people experienced when they heard Mose on stage. Affairs went on prosperously at the Olympic until the year of 1848, when a change began to manifest itself in its fortunes. Baker concocted a piece called New York as It Is, the principal character of which was Mose. Mr. Chanfrau played the character of Mose with such effect and truthfulness that the author of this concoction may be grateful to him that it was not hissed off the stage most contemptuously. The night following, Mose obtained for it a rather warm reception, and by one of those unaccountable freaks of public mind, quite a furor was created, and nothing was heard, sung, or talked about but Mose. For 4 months did this unmitigated conglomeration of vulgarity and illiteracy keep the stage, a compliment entirely due to Mr. Chanfrau. Except for the action of this gentleman, there was not a redeeming feature in the whole affair. It was low in design, vulgar in language, and improbable in plot. Unquestionably, the treasury of Mr. Mitchell profited greatly for the time by the success of this piece. But when the public curiosity had been somewhat satisfied, and Mose no longer drew the crowds after him, what was the spectacle presented to the eye of the manager of the Olympic? Why, the boxes no longer shone with the elite of the city. The character Mose instead of appearing on stage, was in the pit and in the boxes and in the gallery. It was Mose, 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 and the respectability of the house moseyed on too. Yep, Mose made the Olympic great, but he also made it possible for the Olympics' demise. Now, Chanfrau, he went on to play the character in other plays and in other theaters, but the Olympic never found a financial replacement for Mose, and it never recovered. And the theaters keep moving uptown, following the money and staying away from cholera and yellow fever spreading in the denser inner city. So just up the block from here is Niblo's Garden and Theater. And it opened on the east side of Broadway between Houston and Prince Streets in 1828. Now, Niblo's was originally a pleasure garden with an ice cream stand in the center. William Niblo was a waiter there, and he married into the ice cream business. His father-in-law died, and he found himself owning a pleasure garden. He seems like the nicest, jolliest guy, if maybe a little bit over his head. As a summer resort, nothing could be more attractive than Niblo's Garden before its destruction by fire. The splendid theater now erected on the old grounds, the entire occupancy of the pretty garden by buildings, has destroyed the most attractive features of the place. Niblo's Garden used to be patronized by a large class of people who had a holy horror of profane theaters, but how they reconcile to their tender consciences to go there now puzzles us exceedingly. To call the extensive ice creamery uptown Niblo's Theater, we suspect would be fatal to Niblo's interest, and he very wisely, although there's scarcely a handful of dirt for a flower pot, still continues the old name of Niblo's Garden. I like that. It's not much of a garden anymore, but if Niblo calls it a theater, nobody will go. And it burns down yet again, and it's rebuilt even bigger. It's this massive hotel and elaborate entertainment center with a beautiful theater inside. It had over 3,000 seats. Okay, I got to tell you just quickly this accidental story of how it was the home of the first official American musical, the first book musical called The Black Crook in 1866. Get this, Niblo is approached by a theater owner down the block whose theater has burnt down, yes. This manager had just brought in a ballet company from Europe, and he goes to Niblo and says, look, I've got all these dancers and no theater. Can you use them? Niblo says, well, I'm about to do this really bad play. Want to put them in it and see what happens? Here are a couple of the performers in it. But the playwright, he wasn't happy with this at all. Turns out it's the biggest hit ever. And that is how the American musical theater genre was born. The Black Crook, it's sort of the Cats or the Lion King of its day, has the highest production values, really large cast, state-of-the-art technology. I mean, it's a giant extravaganza, and it runs for decades. Tours all around the country. It even comes back to New York for a few different sit-downs. It was a really big deal. Time for another trivia question. Here we go. Okay, now there are just a few cemeteries in the city that are known for being home to the big stars of stage and screen. Which one holds Niblo's vault? It's very nice, has a little pond in front of it. So what's the name of that cemetery where Niblo is today? Okay, so let's move up the block a little bit more to the Astor Place Opera House below 8th Street between Broadway and Bowery. I found it interesting that such an important theater is located where these two competing boulevards almost reconnect. You will see here in a second there, geographically alone, it looks like the two theaters were destined to collide. Anyway, until recently, it was a Starbucks on the corner, and there have been apartments above it since 1995. It's not remembered for very much, really, just one event, the Astor Place riots of 1849. Because the riots so dominate its history, I mean, they changed the course of America itself. It seems odd now that this all really began with simultaneous productions of Macbeth, of all things. That's just how important theater was at the time. So important that it could cause riots. And I had more to say about riots, but given what we are living through these past few weeks, I'll let you make the connections. So William Macready here is a British actor who's brought into town by some Broadway upper class types to play Macbeth at the Opera House. It's a role he's already famous for playing throughout Europe. At the same time, however, Edwin Forrest, this American actor, is also playing Macbeth, the People's Macbeth, at a nearby Bowery Theater. Now, these guys have already been crossing paths for years touring Europe, and they're not exactly friendly. So when Forrest finds out that Macready is doing the same role at the Astor Place, he actually buys a ticket and shows up. And in the middle of the show, he stands up and starts heckling the guy. And other audience members join in and heckle Macready as well. This starts to grow over the following days. Anti-British Americans showing up night after night. They make it impossible for the show to go on. And this builds up to the point where there are 15,000 people outside of the Astor Place Theater trying to get in just to protest this British guy who had the nerve to come to America to play Macbeth. So what began as dueling Macbeths turns bad and becomes something much more important. It's class struggle and rebellion. One side represents our English heritage and the other our new Americanism. Americans versus the English, the lower class versus the upper class. Words out on the street, working men, shall Americans or English rule this city? That was the kind of thing being posted around town to get people to come out and protest, demonizing the English and building up fear of British rule returning. You better fight or they're going to take our country back. Today, some people question who really is American, with people yelling, go back to where you came from. I'm not exactly saying this is the same thing, right? But you know, it's been a tough couple of weeks, and I'll let you guys sort all that out. At the instant that Macbeth after the exit of the servant in Banquo, strikes that superlative tragic attitude where he exclaims, "Is this a dagger which I see before me, its handle towards my hand?" A chair of respectable dimensions was suddenly hurled from the north wing of the amphitheater where it nearly overhangs the stage, accompanied with the stentorian answer which sounded clear and distinct above the fearful uproar which filled the house at the time. "No, you miserable John Bull, it's a chair, and be damned to you." Well, the missile fell at Macready's feet, crushed into shapeless lumber, while the startled actor, for the first time, evinced signs of wavering. "Go off the stage! Clear out, goddamn your English soul!" Another chair was following it and was already midway in its descent from the upper regions when Mr. Macready, doubtless considering he had stood this sort of appeal full long as prudence warranted, vanished behind the wings, and the curtain fell amid the hootings and screams, such as could only be imagined as prevalent in pandemonium. And thus passed the first memorable night of the Astor Place riots. Had the matter ended here, it would have been well. We might regret, indeed, that a stranger and an actor of really great merit should have met with such uncourteous treatment, but we should have been spared the remembrance of one of the darkest stains upon the character of this city. After a few days, the crowds, they keep showing up and the National Guard is called in. They can't get the crowd to disperse, and eventually they crack down. They shoot over 100 and kill more than 20 Americans. This is not the first or the last riot, but it's the first time our government ever kills its own innocent citizens. And it's one of the worst riots in U.S. history. That was indeed a great stain on our society, and I've never heard it documented so well. You know, it's one thing to read a historian writing about what they think happened a century ago, but North Hall is writing this just 3 years after the riots took place. It's such a special insight to such an important event, not just in theater history, but American history. And this is the inside scoop from someone who was there. Okay, so we've gotten this far, and nothing can match that drama, but I want to share just one last chapter. Phineas Taylor Barnum and his American Museum. If you caught Justin's FIDI virtual tour, you probably heard a little bit about this guy. And I'm just a big fan of circus arts, and I've read a lot about this now controversial showman, but nothing like the way North Hall captures him. P.T. Barnum actually takes us back downtown to where our journey began, where the Tweed Courthouse stands today. After some time as a small business owner in Connecticut, he came to the city in 1834. Barnum actually got his start managing Vauxhall Garden. But in 1841, he purchases both the building and the assets of the fledgling American Museum. It was originally on the north side of City Hall Park in a former almshouse. But then he moves on to a much larger 5-story building on the corner of Broadway and Ann Street, right across from St. Paul's Chapel. Barnum turns it into his own special kind of entertainment complex, selling hoaxes and human curiosities and various dioramas, panoramas, and cosmoramas, he called them. It's part zoo, part museum, part lecture hall, part theater, part freak show. It contains a lot of the typical humbug that Barnum is known for, but Barnum also exhibited General Tom Thumb, a very small but very talented performer. Barnum toured with him for decades. And then there's Jenny Lind, a very talented and very well-known singer who was a new high point for Barnum. She makes a lot of money for Barnum, but really, he wanted more than just money. Barnum presents Jenny Lind at the Castle Garden in Battery Park. Now, for as much as we know of Barnum as the con artist who's out to dupe people, the man who famously said there's a sucker born every minute, Barnum really does want to be respected. He wants to show that he's doing more than just exhibiting freaks, and he did have one of the most elaborate exhibition halls. At its peak, the museum was open 15 hours a day and had as many as 15,000 visitors come through its door in a single day. Some 38 million customers paid 25 cents admission between 1841 and 1865. And the total population in 1860 of the entire United States was only 32 million. And in addition to those exhibits, Barnum builds a great theater inside of the museum called the Moral Lecture Room, because calling it a theater was still problematic. It has thousands of seats and the most lavish decor. A temperance play here called The Drunkard was actually the longest running production in the city at the time. And if you haven't figured out the drill yet, yes, on July 13th, 1865, the American Museum burnt to the ground in one of the most spectacular fires New York has ever seen. Animals in the museum were jumping from the burning building only to be shot by police officers. Many of the animals were unable to escape the burning blaze, and they burned to death in their enclosures, including 2 beluga whales who boiled to death in their tanks. Okay, then later, after yet another fire, the building is not rebuilt this time, and that's the end of Barnum's American Museum. 25 years and 3 buildings later, Barnum has finally had enough. But he does go on to run for Congress and serves 2 terms. Okay, we'll finish up quickly here. There are a lot of fun things in the last chapter of the book. I actually started slowing down reading it because I just didn't want it to be over. There's lots of playbills and announcements, cast lists, individual show details. Here's one. Check out this playbill. William Mitchell is advertising a play at the Olympic on the bottom part by putting a bigger show above it just to make fun of how over the top it is, you know, and his show produced without an immense expense. The scenery is painted on less than 30,000 square feet. It has not been many months in preparation. I thought that was humorous. Anyway, North Hall is a critic, of course, so there's a lot of talk about which shows are good and which are bad, but there's also a good deal of gossip and stories that sort of reconnect back to one another. One moment he's all about artistic revolution, and the next he's like today's paparazzi. He projects intellectualism, but he really loves his guilty pleasures. And then it hit me. I can see what this guy is getting at, even though I'm sure he couldn't at the time. This is the story of the birth of Broadway, how it starts and how it begins moving up to Midtown. I mean, were it not for Central Park, the theater district might very well be on the other side of Harlem by now. One last trivia question. Okay, you ready for this one? Okay, the Lyceum Theater is currently the oldest Broadway theater, built in 1903, followed the same year by the Hudson Theater and the Amsterdam theaters. But what is the oldest surviving theater in the theater district? It's no longer used for Broadway shows. It's very well used, but it is the oldest surviving theater in the theater district. Okay, here's the sappy part. I admit I was kind of sad when I finished the book, but putting this all together gave me a chance to get to know this author even better. I think I have such a passion for this book because he's talking about community, about why we need to come together as a community to share our stories. I mean, North Hall is saying, oh, theater has changed so much. I've just got to write this down and tell you about it, dear reader. Theater seems always just on the edge of revolution, or it's going to die tomorrow. Now, we might not be living in boarding houses like they did, but we still live in awfully small places. So having somewhere to go and people to see is still really important. And these days, of course, I know I am more aware of this than ever. Just knowing that we still have the same dreams and fears that we did 160 years ago gives me hope for the theater's future in this city. That doesn't mean we won't be dramatic about it, but hey, let's hope we can get out really soon and enjoy the theater again. So I really appreciate you guys listening to this, and if anybody ever asks you how theater began in New York, now you'll have an answer. Thank you for listening.
Excellent, Ralph. Awesome. So cool. And also trivia went well. I realized, thank you to Marcy, Michael Caine, who definitely won the day by answering 4 correct, although his first was private. So what I'm going to do is, Michael, you do win. I am going to give you the free subscription for the month.
Way to go, Michael!
But also Pete, who also answered Maiden Lane correctly at the same time publicly, Pete Tannen. And Marie, who also answered Francis Tavern publicly at the same time, will
Yeah.
also be considered winners of that question. So what, if you do not mind, so Pete Tannen, Stanley Zucker, and I think, and Marie, if you would email me, I'm putting my, I think you all probably have my email anyway. We can decide what your prizes are and how I get them to you. Marie already said she doesn't want one, but Marie, if you change your mind, let me know. Thank you. So Pete and Stanley, basically, at this point, then get back to me. Michael, you get the free month of membership. Any questions? I know we had 2 questions pop up, so let me go back. One of which was from Matthew Kingsley, who asked, basically unrelated to the presentation, but related to theater. Are there plans for your group, or any plans that you know of during this time, for theater to happen during COVID?
Wow. You know, I've been following it very closely. And, you know, I do think one thing is these Zoom things are not going to stop. You know, even when we do go back to theaters, I think there are a lot of people working on new forms of Zoom and new forms of live theater online, that we're still going to see a bunch of that. And I'm involved with a group called the League of Independent Theaters, and they're trying to work out some sort of deal with the city to have certain parks available for performance, because if it does start up, it will probably start up outdoors first. But right now the city is not granting any public assembly permits in parks. So they're trying to work on that. And I have seen some interesting sort of reconfigurations and new layouts of theater where they may be able to perform. But it seems right now, and I know the Governor Cuomo has talked about this, the problem is quite often, how do you get people in and get people out? You know, because they'll have to queue up somewhere, and that may bring them in closer contact and make social distancing harder. But if we can figure out the before and after, I think there are some solutions to actually viewing the performance. But, you know, the answers may not come before a vaccine.
Right. And again, as I've in some of the people that I know in my world, it's the answer is exactly the same. They're going to keep doing virtual for as long as need be until there's a vaccine and until we can gather in large groups, but they're going to see what they can do in outdoor public spaces where people can socially distance and also enjoy theater.
Can I just say, I find
Yeah.
it interesting that one of the newest sort of parts of theater, the newest job role, is kind of the projection designer. You know, we didn't have a lot of projection in theaters the way we do now. And from what I have seen, it's these projection designers that are working on these different sort of software packages. And I think they're going to be beta testing some of these in August. And soon, Zoom will no longer be square boxes. You'll be able to move people around into different places on the screens and stuff. So I'm really encouraged by projection designers and what they're doing in terms of writing new code.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, you look at what SNL did, you know, Saturday Night Live did with their SNL from home, and that even from one episode to the next, you see how they got everybody progressively better with the technology to make it more interesting than just, you know, Zooms with the virtual backgrounds that are shimmering like mine is behind me. So I think theater is going to, I'm hoping theater follows suit. I actually think this will be a very interesting and a new page for theater, which I think is you know, wider audiences. And when we showed The Eternal Space, we had 90 some odd people show up. That would have been a sold out night for me at Theater Row. So, you know, that's, and everybody was, you know, at home enjoying it.
Yeah.
We also had another interesting fact and or question that I'm not sure if you have the answer to, but I forgot who it was, but somebody brought up, and I've got to go back, Laura Keene, who was performing at American Cousin at the night Lincoln was assassinated, became the owner and manager of the Olympia Theater. Did that come up in your research? That's a pretty neat factoid.
Yeah. You know, After a while, I mean, as you can see, there's already so much information in
Sure.
this presentation that I actually had to start cutting out so many things. But, you know, with the way these troops would go from town to town, whether it was Ford's Theater or a lot of theater in Philadelphia, a lot of theater in the Williamsburg colony, you know, there were a lot of things moving around. And, you know, I'd love to do something one time on just the troops and the different theaters that they performed at. But there was a lot going on, and I am still sort of processing a lot of that sort of information.
Yeah. Somebody requested if you could put up the chronology of the theater screen again. Is that possible?
Ah, yeah, I wasn't quite sure of the animation of that, but there it is. The ones in yellow are the ones that I spoke about. And then you can see in white, there are a few of them that I skipped over. But I think for the most part, that's kind of the top 20.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And also, again, we'll be posting. I'm going to try to get this video up by tomorrow. So you can come back, pause it, or you could take a screenshot of it right now while it's up. And let me see. I thought there might have been another question. We had so many back and forths between the answers.
Hey, Justin,
yeah.
for people that didn't know the answers to the trivia questions, should I go over those?
I gave the correct answers, but if you want to, I mean, that's up to you.
You did. Okay.
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
So the answer was Maiden Lane, Benedict Arnold Newspaper Row, Francis Tavern, Greenwood Cemetery, and the New Victory.
Yeah, the Benedict Arnold one I found very interesting. Benedict Arnold got away. A lot of people don't recall that. The only person who lost their life over the whole Benedict Arnold affair was this one guy, Major John Andre. And actually they wrote many plays and things re-crucifying this guy over and over again in the years after the revolution was over.
Right. It's so true. He gets dragged through the mud. Stanley Zucker actually posted a really good, which I got wrong, so I'm a little bit ashamed, follow-up trivia question to the Park Theater, which was, and now I'm trying to find it because this was a very long chat.
Well, I hope you had a good time chatting.
So let's see. That was very lively. Oh, here it is. It's coming up. Let's see if anybody gets it. No prize for this one. This will just be, where'd it go?
While he's bringing...
Which famous duel originated in the Park Theater?
I'm sorry?
This came from Stanley Zucker. Which famous duel originated in the Park Theater?
Oh, a duel. Ah.
And I was close, but not, I was close by half a damn.
Yeah, I remember something about that, but I wouldn't recall who that was. Did Stanley have the answer?
I do. I'll give you the answer, but if I'm just waiting to see if anybody gets it.
Oh, okay.
Just as a little bit of fun.
While you're bringing that up, I just might mention the Chapel Theater, which was one of the really early ones. I understand was a cute little beautiful theater. And when the Stamp Act was passed, the British were performing in the Chapel Theater, and the local residents were so pissed off at the Stamp Act, they actually stormed the Chapel Theater during a performance and literally ripped the theater apart.
There is a precedent for that in New York history.
Man, yeah.
It's so interesting. So the answer was nobody jumped in. George Eaker and Philip Hamilton. So Alexander's son, which I remembered, Alexander Hamilton's son died the same exact way in the same spot. It started, that duel started in the Park Theater. So thank you, Stanley, for that interesting tidbit, which we were talking about during the presentation. And again, if nobody else has any questions for Ralph, Ralph, we thank you. This was great. Sester said, if you want to see a dramatic and sympathetic treatment of Major John Andre, check out the AMCC. Oh, Turn. Yes. That is true. He does get a sympathetic treatment in Turn.
And also Richard Nelson, I believe he's doing some Zoom shows with the Public Theater right now. He wrote a play called Two Shakespearean Actors maybe a decade or two ago, which covers the whole Astor Place riots thing from the point of view of the performers.
Yeah, and that was great. You went really in depth into it. I cover that when we do our underground subway tour. When we get to Astor Place and the Clinton Hall door is sealed up there on Astor Place, I always
Yeah.
talk about the Opera House riots, and you really got into it. So it's awesome.
One of the trivia questions that got cut was what was the name of the building when it was torn down? And my friends thought nobody's going to get Clinton Hall.
Anybody who would be on the subway tour hopefully would if they were listening.
Yeah, yeah.
But all right. So thank you all. Thank you, Ralph. Ralph, I'm so glad we did this. We came back. It was awesome. And again, if I called your name, I feel like I'm really in teacher mode today. If I call your name, please email me, justin@untaptcities.com.
Yeah, get that merchandise, people. And also, if you want to know anything else about what I do with my company, you can always go to peculiarworks.org.
Yes, I posted the peculiarworks.org at the top of the chat, and then also the donate pay link at the end of the chat.
Sure.
So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Justin.
It is my pleasure, and I hope to see you guys out there again. Maybe one day we'll collaborate on a Penn Station piece like we talked about.
Yeah.
So,
Indeed.
everybody have a yes, well done, Ralph. And yeah, let me know. I've got a Penn Station show, as you know, more stuff to go. But
Yeah.
okay, have a good week.
Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
A real quick plug for next week's programming. We have Tactile Modernism with Karen Payson on Tuesday. On Wednesday, John DeSanto is coming back for his behind the scenes Rainbow Room talk on his time there as Mater D. And then we've got our virtual behind the scenes tour at the UN in partnership with the UN. So have a really, really great weekend, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you, Ralph. Thanks all. Have a good one. Happy 4th. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy 4th, everybody. Enjoy safely. Have a good one.
Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Bye.